The last ferry of the night was supposed to be a routine trip across the cold waters of Lake Superior. It was August 17, 2026, and Daniel Mercer had already missed 2 earlier departures because of a delayed flight and a broken rental car. By the time he reached the small ferry terminal in northern Michigan, the parking lot was almost completely empty. A single ferry waited beyond the dock, its lights glowing through the thick fog that had rolled across the water. Daniel checked his ticket again. Destination, Bellweather Island. Departure, 11:40 p.m. The name meant nothing to him. He had been visiting Michigan for a photography assignment and needed to photograph an abandoned lighthouse on the island the following morning. But when he showed his ticket to the woman at the booth, she stared at it for several seconds and quietly said, "You're going to Bellweather?" Daniel nodded. She looked toward the ferry and then back at him. "That ferry hasn't gone there in a long time." When Daniel asked how long, she answered, 23 years. Daniel laughed, thinking she was joking, but the woman didn't smile. She told him Bellweather Island had been removed from the ferry routes in 2003 because of an accident. Before Daniel could ask what happened, the ferry horn blasted across the harbor, and the woman whispered, "Get on." There were only 6 passengers boarding the ferry. An elderly couple carrying identical black suitcases, a young man wearing a yellow raincoat, a woman holding a sleeping child, and a fisherman who never looked up from the floor. Daniel immediately noticed something strange. None of them had checked in at the ticket booth. He turned toward the terminal, expecting to see the woman behind the glass, but she had disappeared. The ferry doors closed, the engine started, and they pulled away from the dock. Daniel watched the terminal lights disappear into the fog. For the first 20 minutes, everything seemed normal. The lake was dark and perfectly still, and the ferry moved slowly through the thick white mist. Daniel tried to use his phone, but there was no signal. He opened the map application and saw his blue location dot sitting in the middle of the lake. Then he noticed something wrong. Bellweather Island was marked as the destination, but when he zoomed in, the map showed nothing but open water. There was no island, no road, no lighthouse, and no land at all. Daniel approached the captain's cabin and found the door slightly open. He knocked, but nobody answered. When he pushed the door open, the cabin was completely empty. The controls were operating by themselves, and the steering wheel was slowly turning from left to right, as though an invisible captain were guiding the ferry. Daniel noticed the navigation screen and realized the ferry wasn't traveling toward Bellweather Island. Instead, it was heading toward a set of coordinates that didn't exist on any map. He pulled out his camera and photographed the screen. When the flash went off, he saw a face reflected in the cabin window behind him. Daniel spun around immediately, but there was nobody there. Before he could move, the elderly man with the black suitcase appeared behind him. The man looked terrified and told Daniel, "You shouldn't photograph anything." Daniel asked why, and the old man stared toward the dark window before whispering, "Because it knows when you see it." Then he walked away. At exactly midnight, the fog became so thick that Daniel couldn't see the front of the ferry. Suddenly, the engine stopped. The entire vessel became silent. There were no waves, no wind, and no machinery. The other passengers stood perfectly still. The woman holding the child stared at the floor. The young man in the yellow raincoat pressed his hands against his ears. The fisherman whispered something under his breath. Daniel approached him and asked what had happened. The fisherman slowly looked up and said, "We arrived." Daniel turned toward the windows. Through the fog, something enormous was taking shape. At first it looked like a cliff, but then he realized it was a shoreline. An island had appeared out of nowhere. Dark trees covered the land, their branches twisting against the night sky, and beyond them stood a lighthouse. Daniel recognized it immediately. It was the exact lighthouse from the photographs his client had sent him. The lighthouse was supposed to have been abandoned for decades, yet its light was turning slowly across the water. The ferry moved toward an old wooden dock. Daniel checked his phone again. The screen showed 12:03 a.m., but then something impossible happened. The date changed. August 17th, 2026 disappeared, and the phone now read August 17th, 2003. Daniel dropped it in shock. The passengers began walking toward the exit without saying a word. Daniel asked what was happening, but nobody answered. The ferry doors opened, and cold mist poured inside. Daniel stepped onto the dock, and when he turned around, the ferry was gone. There was only fog where it had been moments earlier. He shouted for the captain, but there was no response. Then he heard footsteps behind him. A little girl was standing at the end of the dock. She wore an old-fashioned yellow raincoat, and her hair was completely soaked. Her face was pale, almost gray, and she looked directly at Daniel without blinking. "You're late," she said. Daniel couldn't understand what she meant. He asked where the other passengers had gone, but she ignored the question and pointed toward the lighthouse. "They've been waiting for you." Daniel looked around and realized the other passengers had disappeared. The girl turned and began walking toward the lighthouse, leaving wet footprints behind her. Daniel followed because the dock behind him had vanished into the fog. The path was covered with wet leaves and surrounded by tall, twisted trees. As they walked, Daniel noticed photographs nailed to the trunks. There were hundreds of them. Each photograph showed people standing on the same ferry, but some looked terrified, some were smiling, and others were blurred as if the camera couldn't properly capture their faces. Daniel stopped at one photograph and felt his stomach drop. He was standing in it. The picture showed him aboard the ferry only minutes earlier, but beneath the photograph was a date. August 17th, 2003. Daniel ran toward the lighthouse. Inside, the walls were covered with names, hundreds of them. Some were followed by dates, while others had no dates at all. Daniel realized they were names of passengers who had disappeared over the years. Near the bottom of the list, he saw 6 names belonging to the people who had been on the ferry with him. Then he saw his own name, Daniel Mercer. But unlike the others, there was no date beside it. He stepped backward in horror. The lighthouse door suddenly slammed shut. The little girl stood halfway up the staircase watching him. She told him he needed to leave before the light turned 3 times. Daniel asked what would happen if it turned 3 times. The girl looked at him with tears in her eyes and whispered, "You become part of the island." The lighthouse beam swept across the windows once. Daniel ran down the stairs. He reached the door, but it wouldn't open. The second beam passed over the island, and everything outside began changing. The trees seemed to disappear and reappear. Houses appeared in the fog and then vanished. The dock flickered like an old photograph. Daniel pulled the door with all his strength until it finally opened. He sprinted toward the shoreline. The island seemed to be collapsing around him. The lighthouse beam began its 3rd rotation. Daniel could hear whispers coming from the trees. Hundreds of voices were calling his name. He reached the dock and saw the dark water below. There was no ferry. There was nowhere to escape. As the 3rd beam began crossing the island, Daniel jumped into the freezing water. Something grabbed his ankle. He looked down and saw a pale hand reaching from beneath the dock. He kicked violently, but the hand tightened around his leg. Daniel screamed and kicked again until the fingers suddenly released him. He plunged beneath the freezing surface. For several seconds he couldn't tell which direction was up. Then everything went black. When Daniel opened his eyes, he was lying on the floor of the ferry. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows. The captain was standing over him, asking if he was okay. Daniel sat up in confusion and looked around. The ferry was approaching the mainland. There were no other passengers. Daniel immediately checked his phone. It showed August 18th, 2026. He searched the map for Bellweather Island, but there was nothing. He asked the captain about the island. The captain stared at him strangely and said there was no island by that name. Daniel opened his camera and checked the photographs. Most of the images were corrupted, but one photograph remained. It showed Bellweather Island beneath a dark sky. The lighthouse stood in the center, and dozens of people were gathered around it. Daniel zoomed in. The 6 passengers were there. The little girl was there, and behind them stood a man holding a camera. It was Daniel. But the man in the photograph looked older than he was. He was wearing different clothes and standing beside a wall covered in writing. Daniel zoomed in further and saw 2 words carved into the lighthouse wall: "Coming soon." He immediately closed the camera. When Daniel reached the ferry terminal, he found the same woman from the ticket booth. He rushed toward her and asked about Bellweather Island. The woman stared at him as though he had said something impossible. She told him there was no Bellweather Island. Daniel showed her the photograph. The woman's face turned pale. She quietly closed the booth window and refused to speak. Daniel asked again what happened in 2003. After several seconds, she whispered that the ferry had disappeared that year. It had been carrying 6 passengers and a crew member. Search teams found nothing. No wreckage, no bodies, and no evidence that the ferry had ever existed. The woman then looked toward the water and said something Daniel would never forget. That ferry shouldn't have returned. Daniel followed her gaze. The ferry he had just traveled on was still sitting at the dock. For the first time, he noticed the name painted across its side. It wasn't the name of the ferry company, it simply said Bellweather. Daniel never returned to Michigan. 3 days later, he mailed his camera to his client and refused to explain what had happened. But the photographs began appearing online without his permission. One photograph appeared at midnight. Then another appeared the following night. Each image showed the same island, the same lighthouse, and the same fog-covered dock. The first photograph showed Daniel standing near the lighthouse. The second showed the woman from the ferry terminal. The third showed someone Daniel had never seen before, a man from Minnesota who had disappeared 23 years earlier. Authorities investigated the images but couldn't identify where they had been taken. Satellite images showed nothing but open water. Maps contained no Bellweather Island. Coast Guard records showed no ferry by that name. Yet sailors in the region continued reporting a strange light appearing across the lake on foggy nights. Weeks later, Daniel received one final photograph in an envelope with no return address. The image showed the Bellweather Lighthouse at exactly 11:40 p.m. Standing in front of it were dozens of people. Some were passengers from the original ferry. Others were people who had disappeared years earlier. The little girl stood at the center of them all. Daniel looked closer and realized there was one empty space beside her. Beneath the lighthouse, a wooden sign had appeared that hadn't been there before. It read, "Next ferry, 11:40 p.m. Daniel turned the photograph over. On the back was a handwritten message. "You were the first passenger. You won't be the last." That night, Daniel heard a ferry horn outside his apartment. 3 long blasts echoed through the darkness. He looked through the window and saw nothing but empty streets. Then his phone began ringing. The caller ID showed a number that didn't exist. Daniel answered. A little girl's voice whispered, "The ferry is here." The line went dead. Since that night, Daniel has never spoken publicly about Bellweather Island. But sailors still report seeing a ferry moving through the fog where no ferry route exists. It always appears at 11:40 p.m. It always carries 6 passengers. And sometimes when the fog is thick enough, people standing on the shore say they can see a 7th passenger watching them through one of the windows. He is always holding a camera. He never moves. He never speaks. He simply watches the shore as the ferry disappears into the darkness. Bellweather Island still doesn't exist on any map. It doesn't appear on satellite images, government records, or navigation systems. But if you are ever near Lake Superior and hear 3 long ferry blasts after midnight, don't follow the sound. Don't answer if someone calls your name from the water. And whatever you do, don't take a photograph. Because Bellweather Island may not exist in our world, but something on that island knows exactly who is looking for it. And once it knows you're there, the next ferry may already have your name on its passenger list.